It's great to welcome back to the program today Johan Hari, who is the author of the book Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Johan, it's so great to talk to you again.
Hey, David, I love your show, so I'm really happy to be back.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be able to flesh this issue out more with you because now that your book's been out a little longer, there have been a bunch of fascinating interviews that you've done. There have been endless interesting commentaries about your perspective on depression, some of which agree with it, elements that disagree with it. And I think it's just a great opportunity to really get into more depth about what you uncovered and the work that you've done. So maybe just to start, let's like recontextualize depression in 2019 a little bit. To make an analogy, there's a lot written about back pain as a phenomenon. And one of the things we're sort of learning is that back pain in the way that it manifests in the West doesn't seem to happen in some parts of the world. And there are questions as to whether back pain is more of a result of the sort of physiological realities of living in the West in the information age in office jobs, or maybe more emotional and psychosomatic and psychological. And it turns out that, well, it seems like it's a complex combination of the two in different proportions, depending on which example we're talking about. Is that a fair way to also think about depression in 2019?
I haven't looked into this debate about back pain. I'm kind of aware of it like you are, so I don't feel comfortable talking about that
Yes.
analogy. Interesting. I think it's an interesting perspective, and I'd like to learn more about the debate about back pain that you're talking about. I think for me, I think you're right to suggest that this is a question that is more complex than we've generally been prompted to think over the last 30 years. I wrote my book Lost Connections because there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me. The first mystery was I'm 40 years old, and all throughout my life, depression and anxiety have increased in the United States, in Britain, and in fact across the Western world. And I wanted to understand, well, why? Right? Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And I wanted to understand it also because of a more personal mystery, which is that when I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me. I couldn't control it. I was ashamed of it. I didn't understand why it was happening. And my doctor told me a story that I now realize was really well meant, but was hugely oversimplified. My doctor said, well, we know why people feel like this. Some people just naturally get a kind of chemical imbalance in their brain. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you some drugs and you'll be fine. And I started taking an antidepressant called Paxil, and I felt significantly better for a while, but not that long afterwards, this feeling of pain started to come back. So I was given higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum possible dose you're allowed to take. And for a lot of those 13 years, and pretty much all the time by the end, I was still in a lot of pain. So I started asking myself, well, what's going on here? Because according to the story that I'm being told, I'm doing everything I'm meant to do, yet I'm still feeling a lot of distress. And there seems to be a lot of people around me in a similar situation. So for the book, I wanted to use my training as a social scientist in social sciences at Cambridge University, and my training as a journalist to really just travel to lots of different places. I ended up traveling over 40,000 miles. I wanted to sit with the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety, and people with very different perspectives, and people who come through depression in all sorts of different ways. And I learned a huge amount, but I think the heart of the answer you're getting at is I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety so far. There'll be others that we don't know about yet, probably. And 2 of those causes are indeed in our biology. So your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems, though they don't write your destiny. And there are real brain changes that happen when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that have been proven to cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. They're factors in the way we live. And once you understand them, that opens up a very different set of solutions and a very different way of understanding the pain and distress that spread so deeply across our societies.
Can you talk a little bit about what were in the travels that you did? Yes, you talked about 40,000 miles in the research and writing of this book. Was there any place or area where the depression that you learned about or were told takes place there or is prevalent is markedly different than the majority or the predominant type of Western depression that we hear about, that you can think of, where there was something different going on in your mind?
Well, there were places where they had a different understanding of the way out.
Hmm.
So I'll give you an example. I went to interview a South African psychiatrist named Dr. Derek Summerfield, who's a wonderful person. And I went to see him partly because I was really struggling with this shift in perspective from thinking of this as a problem in my brain, which is how I've been told to think about it and how I thought about it for 13 years, to thinking of it as a wider problem with many causes in the way we live, as well as some biological causes. And it really began to fall into place for me when I went to see Dr. Summerfield. So he happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs. They were like, what are they? And Dr. Summerfield explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he was like, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy like St. John's wort, ginkgo biloba, something like that. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the American invasion of Southeast Asia, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg, and after a while he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's super painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm guessing it was pretty traumatic for this guy to go back and work in the fields where he got blown up. He started to cry all day. After a while, he refused to get out of bed. He developed all the classic symptoms of depression. The Cambodian doctor said, well, this is when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield was like, well, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. It was hard for him to see it in the throes of his depression. Actually had perfectly understandable causes in his life. One of them figured, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't have to work in the rice fields. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, the Cambodians, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way that most of us were, that it's just a problem in your brain, that sounds like a bad joke, right? I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from that individual unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical body in the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy, you're not weak, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical help to get those needs met. This is why the leading doctor at the United Nations on this topic, in their official statement for World Health Day, said a few years ago, we need to talk less about chemical imbalances and more about the imbalances in the way we live. Now, this is not to say there aren't very real biological contributions. There are. It's not to say that drugs don't give some relief to some people. They do. They gave relief to me for a while. But precisely because this problem goes much deeper than our biology, the solutions need to go much deeper too. And I went to lots of places in the world, from Colombia to an Amish village in Indiana to Cambodia, where people didn't need to be told that, where they knew intuitively that depression is a signal, right? Depression is not a malfunction. The way that we've been taught to think about it in this culture for the vast majority of people is to think about depression as effectively what we're told as a story. Think about what my doctor told me, again, with really good intentions, was your depression is like a glitch in a machine, right? It's like a wiring problem in your brain. But actually, what the best evidence shows is while there are biological contributions that can make you more sensitive and can pose obstacles to getting out, actually, for the overwhelming majority of depressed and anxious people, we feel these ways for reasons that sure can be hard to see when you're in depression. I know that very well. And that actually the key is to solve the underlying problems.
Yeah, so let's dig into that a little bit, because okay, let's put aside for a second what we're talking about in terms of genetic predispositions, chemical imbalances, and we'll focus kind of on the environmental and situational. In the West, there are stories about phone usage and social media makes people anxious and depressed. There's situational depression after someone a loved one has passed away, for example, which is really sort of a different category in many cases of depression. There is the sort of involvement in the never ending Western vulture capitalist rat race, which can create this sort of like systemic depression and anxiety in people. Can you talk a little bit about what we mean when we say, at least in the modern West, the sort of circumstances that lead to depression?
Well, I go through lots of them in my book, Lost Connections. I think you've gone to a really important point, David. I think something actually you cover a lot on your show brilliantly. Part of the problem with the biological model, right? There is some truth in it. There are real biological contributions to depression. But part of what it's done is profoundly depoliticize the pain caused by neoliberalism. So what you've had is a massive increase in depression. I think you and I are about the same age. How old are you, David?
I'm 35.
Yeah, so we're about the same age, or a little bit younger than me. All throughout our lives, depression and anxiety have increased. There's very strong evidence, for example, financial insecurity causes depression, right? That's not rocket science. If you'd said to my grandmother or your grandmother, gee, grandma, do you think being really stressed about money is going to make you more likely to become depressed? My grandmother would have clipped me around the ear and said, why are you wasting my time, right? Asking me such stupid questions. If you think about many of the factors in the way we live that have increased people's depression and anxiety, you've seen those forces, and at the same time you've seen, and this is not a conspiracy or anyone consciously doing this, you've seen the rise of a story that says, oh no, your depression isn't anything to do with all of those things. The fact that half of all Americans, through no fault of their own, have less than $500 in savings for if a crisis comes along, which is going to make you really anxious and really depressed. And I can talk about some of the science of how we know that if you like. Rather than saying to people, well, that's why you feel that way. Your pain makes sense. It's perfectly understandable that you feel that way. What we've done is tell people, oh, mysteriously, you've all just got a chemical imbalance in your brains around the same time as things like inequality rise. So I'll give you some specific examples of things, deep factors in the way we live and how we can deal with them. So I noticed that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I started to look at what's the evidence around this, right? YouGov did a really detailed, Gallup did a really detailed study of this in the United States. What they found is 13% of us, 13%, like our jobs most of the time. 63% are what they called sleepworking. You don't like it, you don't hate it, you just kind of get through it. And 24% of people hate and fear their jobs. I was quite struck by that. 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of their waking lives. And in fact, this thing is expanding over more and more of our lives as we're constantly on call. Started to ask, could this be having some effect on our mental health? So I learned that there was an incredible Australian social scientist named Professor Michael Marmot who made a big breakthrough about this in the 70s. So I went to interview him. And he discovered the key factor that causes depression at work. It's not the only one, but it's the key one. If you go to work and you have low or no control over your job, so you just got to do what you're told, you're significantly more likely to become depressed. Actually, you're more likely to get sick in almost every way. You're more likely to die of a heart attack, other problems. And at first, when I spoke to Professor Marmot, I remember actually really misunderstanding this evidence. So I thought he was saying, okay, you've got this elite 13% of people at the top who get to have nice jobs that they control, like you and me. Great, they're going to be happy. And then you've got everyone else who's condemned to this misery. And I thought about my family. My grandmother's job was to clean toilets. My dad was a bus driver. My brother was an Uber driver. I was like, wait, are you saying these people are just condemned? And Professor Marmot kept explaining to me, it's not the work that makes you depressed. It's being controlled at work. And it turns out, this is me talking now, not him, there's an antidepressant for that. So I went and spent a fair bit of time in several workplaces like this. But I'll give you an example of one. I went to meet a woman called Meredith Keogh in Baltimore. And Meredith used to go to sleep every Sunday night just sick with anxiety. She had an office job, as Meredith would tell you, it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or harassed or anything. But it was monotonous, it was boring, she was controlled, she had no ability to use her mind. And Meredith couldn't bear the thought this was going to be the next 30 years of her life. So with her husband, Josh, she did this quite bold thing. And when people hear this, they think I'm going to say, you should all do this too, dear listener. And that's not what I'm saying. It's an argument for structural change. Josh had worked in bike stores in Baltimore since he was a teenager. It's insecure work. You've got no benefits. You don't even have vacation time unless your boss deigns to give it to you. And one day, Josh was in this bike store with his colleagues, and they asked themselves, what does our boss actually do? Right? They didn't hate their boss. He was actually quite a nice bloke. But they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes, and this other dude seems to make all the money. They decided to set up a bike store of their own called Baltimore Bicycle Works that works on a different principle. So the place they'd worked before, like most people listening to this, they worked in a corporation, right? Very recent human invention, only goes back to the late 19th century. People know how it works. It's like a dictatorship. You've got to obey the boss. Sometimes the boss is nice. Sometimes he's the equivalent of Kim Jong-un. You've got no say over that. You do what the boss tells you. They decided they were going to set up a bike store that worked on an older American idea. Baltimore Bicycle Works is a democratic cooperative. They don't have a boss. They make the decisions about the business together. So in practice, they agree most of the time, but if they don't, they vote on it. They share out the profits. They share out the good tasks and the crappy tasks, so no one gets stuck with the crappy tasks. And one of the things that was so striking to me, spending time with the people at Baltimore Bicycle Works, was totally in line with Preston Marmot's findings, by the way, was how many of them talked about how they had been depressed and anxious before in the previous places they'd worked, but were not depressed and anxious now. It's important to say, it's not like they quit their jobs fixing bikes and went off to become, I don't know, Beyonce's backing singers or something, right? They fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now. What's the difference? Now they've got control over their work. There is no reason we should be structuring our society so that most of us are spending most of our time in institutions that make us feel depressed, anxious, or at the very least, less happy and satisfied than we could be. Every corporation should be a democratic cooperative. Now, that's a big thing. We've got to understand some of the causes of depression that are playing out are big in our society and culture. 1 in 3 middle-aged women in the United States at any given time is taking a chemical antidepressant to get through the day. Even more are taking opioids to deal with their pain to get through the day, psychological pain, as well as, of course, physical pain. Some of these causes are very deep. Others are easier to deal with. But I think we've got to be honest about how deep this crisis goes and how some of the institutions in our society and culture are causing that depression. Because at the moment, what we do is we say, you've got this job where you're humiliated, you're controlled, you can't use your creativity and your mind, and you're miserable. Oh, there's something wrong with you, right? There's something wrong in your brain. Krishnamurti, the great Bengali philosopher, said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Johan, in the sort of limited time we have left, can you talk about the things that don't work particularly well, or at least instances where they don't? So like, for example, SSRI antidepressants, some people overstate how well they work. Some people also understate how well they work. They work okay for some people, better than placebo, to the extent that they continue taking them. And then when people stop, they work a little bit less well. But I want to sort of have a good understanding without over or understating the effectiveness of different treatment modalities.
Well, I think we need to expand our idea of what an antidepressant is. Anything that reduces depression and anxiety should be regarded as an antidepressant.
Yes.
If you are lonely, you are significantly more likely to become depressed. There are programs in Britain where they got lonely people to join gardening programs. It was twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. If you think life is about money and status and showing off, the things that advertising and Instagram and everything like them teach us to believe, you are significantly more likely to become depressed. When people like Professor Tim Kasser at Knox College in Illinois did research where they got people to meet and talk about meaningful values, moments in their life they have actually found meaning and connection, it caused a measurable shift in their values away from some of these forces that cause depression and anxiety. In Sao Paulo, they banned outdoor advertising because they could see advertising makes us depressed. It's constantly prompting us to feel bad. If you had a very traumatic childhood, as I did, and you have a lot of shame about that, that is a massive factor in depression and anxiety. And Dr. Vincent Felitti and other people that I interviewed showed if you give people who've had traumatic childhoods safe places to release that shame, to see that it wasn't their fault they were treated badly, that is a massive antidepressant, massively reduces depression and anxiety. So I'm in favor of a radically expanded menu of antidepressants. On that menu should be chemical antidepressants. They give some relief to some people, which is hugely valuable. They gave relief to me, sadly, for a short time, um, but real relief for a time. But that menu needs to include many more things. There's overwhelming evidence. This isn't my view. This isn't some cranky view. The World Health Organization, the leading medical body in the world, has been warning us for years that this overly biological model is damaging people's health. It tells them that their pain doesn't mean anything. If your story is that it's just in your biology, then that says to people that you just feel this way because of like a glitch. But that's not true. There are biological contributions, but we feel this way for reasons. Those reasons are understandable. When they're explained to people, it's not like rocket science. I think, for example, that list I just gave, which is obviously a partial list, I think everyone listening will have nodded and gone, well, of course, if you're lonely, if you're taught that life is all about money, if you've had a really traumatic childhood, if you're controlled and humiliated at work, you're going to be more likely to become depressed, and dealing with those problems together as a culture will reduce depression and anxiety. We need to restore to people a sense that your pain makes sense. We feel this way for reasons, and together we can deal with those reasons. And one of the reasons I was really inspired in the journey I did for my book, Lost Connections, is because all over the world, from San Francisco to Sydney to Sao Paulo, I saw people who were doing that, who were understanding the deeper causes of depression and were fixing them together. But to do that, the very first thing we have to do is we have to stop insulting these signals by saying they're a sign of weakness or a sign of craziness or purely a biological malfunction. And we need to start listening to these signals because they are telling us something we really need to hear. And it's only when we honor these signals and respect these signals that we can begin to see the liberating, nourishing, deeper solutions, the cows that are waiting all around us.
We've been speaking with Johann Hari, who is, of course, the author of the book Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. Johann, always great to talk to you. Thank you.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure. Thank you for doing such a brilliant show, David. Cheers.